Hi, welcome back. It's Monday. Um, I haven't really done that much weaving this weekend because we had a bit of a health scare um, in our family, and it takes the wind out of your sails when um, there's a lot of worry. So things are better today, and I will continue weaving. And while I'm weaving today, I will read a chapter one in my manuscript that I will eventually publish in regards to the Northwest Coast textiles. So welcome, I'm Evelyn Vanderhoop. Kajuth is my Haida name. I'm Haida Eagle from, my family is from Old Masset. We're Gittinese, which is an Eagle clan. And I'm here on Haida Gwaii, and I will be reading, like I said, a chapter out of my upcoming, someday published manuscript about the Northwest Coast textiles. So, welcome. Chapter 1. Once, not long ago, the Haida lived amongst the natural and supernatural beings of the sea, sky, and forest. Stories passed down through the ages in the families of Haida clans tell of a time before the cedar trees took root on Haida Gwaii, when the islands were covered in water and supernatural beings existed on bare rock. Raven traveling was said to bring about many changes to this sparse world while going about following his curiosity, mischievousness, and greed. When did the supernaturals discover Haida on their island? No one knows the exact date that Raven traveling stubbed his toes on our cockle shell. But the stories are old. As the archipelago of Haida Gwaii evolved with ecological changes, so did the Haida culture. Tales are told of when we lived in depressions dug out of the beach sand and covered with woven mats. Haida caught birds for food, and bird skin garments were protection from the cold. Recent archaeology discoveries on Haida Gwaii prove the stories conceivably fit into the historic environments of ancient floods and vast climate changes since early man arrived. Ancient remnants of Haida Gwaii culture are analyzed to be older than 14,000 years before present time. Northern Graham Islands and part of southeast Alaska were an unglaciated refugium during the last glacial age, and possibly the one before. Insulated by the ice and island, the Haida developed a subsistence that included spiritual dependence on the benevolent forces of nature and the supernatural. Using a language which has no near relative, as well as highly developed iconography, an alliance was established between man, nature, and the spirits of Haida Gwaii. Every new season brought gifts from the plants and animals of food, medicine, and adventure. Haida Gwaii is now lush with a rainforest born out of temperate weather. Wind, laden with moisture, sweeps in from the Pacific Ocean. A canopy of immense spruce, hemlock, alder, and cedar branches drape a forest carpeted with a multitude of moss and fern. The cedar trees were important resources for all of the cultural material of the Haida. Massive canoes, houses, and memorial poles, as well as hunting and carving tools, cooking and eating utensils, storage boxes, basketry cordage, drums, dance regalia, rattles, whistles, and clothing were amongst the infinite things created from the trees, bark, and wood. The inner tree bark fibers were the first to be utilized for clothing in this temperate region. It was the loom and hands of the weavers that dictated the fashions of this coast. In far northern regions of Alaska and Canada, clothing styles were predominated by the hide shape of the animals that were used to create tightly sewn garments for the bitter cold. In regions south of the northwest coast, garment styles also were dictated by the animal hide used in their construction. Plant material was a more practical fiber for the people indigenous to the Pacific Northwest. Women created everyday wear fashioned from yellow and red cedar bark. Weavers harvested the inner cadmian cedar bark layer in the spring during the time when the salmon berry blossoms emerged. They gathered the bark from straight trees, giving thanks and promising them that they would transform their bark into the useful items they intended to weave. In the forest, the women would separate the rough outer bark from the smooth inner layers. Later, in their large cedar-planked homes, they would continue to separate the cadmian layer to fine and narrow strips for plaiting and twining. Bark that was intended for clothing construction was dried and then pounded until the layers separated into soft and fluffy material. Oiled with seal, bear, or deer fat, cedar bark clothing was a perfect material for the rainforest of the Haida archipelago. The conical weaving of cedar bark canoe capes bridged three-dimensional basketry to the two-dimensional cedar bark and mountain goat garments that were constructed on upright looms. The canoe capes were constructed around wood sticks formed into a tripod. The weaver formed loosely twisted cedar barks, or cedar warps, and hung them from a heading cord forming the neckline. Thin strips of yellow cedar weft moved through the hanging warps with a 2-strand twine and 3-strand twining action. This weaving proceeded in one direction, beginning at the neckline and continuing round and round to the cape's bottom edge. Warps were added along the way to accommodate the increased width of the shoulders and chest, as well as the needed space for arm and hand movement. These capes were short in length, never going beyond the elbow of the wearer to allow canoe paddling and arm movement. The canoe cape was put on by placing it over the head through the neckline opening. The northern geometric robes, now coined ravenstail chief's robes, retain the technique of one-directional weaving that was used for making cedar canoe capes and basketry items. Mountain goat wool, thighs spun into warps, were hung from a leather heading cord on a simple horizontal bar loom, supported by 2 poles. They were woven with basketry techniques of 2-strand and 3-strand twining. The weavers of these geometric robes began each row of wool weft on the left side and wove the entire width of the garment. When reaching the right edge, a knot was made, and the remaining weft ends formed a fringe. To maintain a balance, a fringe was added on the left. Each row was separate to itself. Geometric designs made from dyed yellow and black goat's wool portrayed ancient declarations. The completed pure mountain goat wool chief's robe was surrounded by fringe. Long tassels added within the body of the inner design area further embellished the drama created by the swirling fringe on the chief's ravenstail dance robe. Evidence of the evolution of complex weaving techniques that eventually culminated in the creation of Nahin garments are found within cedar robes, aprons, skirts, and mats. The cedar garments were created by hanging pounded red cedar warps from a bar loom. The yellow cedar weft rows were continuous as in the conical canoe capes, but instead of weaving in one direction, the weft rows, when reaching the right edge, were turned and moved down approximately a half-inch and traveled from right to left. These robes do not have side fringe, but the side edges had an added vertical plaited braid. Top and bottom borders were often embellished with black, white, and yellow patterns made from mountain goat dyed wool yarns. The advanced techniques of weaving left as well as right across the width of the garment further evolved into the ability of weaving formline designs in the nahin robes of wool and cedar. Ancient weavers were able to advance the techniques for individual color areas to link with adjoining color areas to produce the designs of the U-form, ovoids, and circles. The linking of step joins and interlock joins were camouflaged over with three-strand braided twining that escaped the warp restrictions and glided over weft joinery, creating the illusion of smooth, curved design fields. Yellow cedar bark was incorporated into the wool of the mountain goat within the thigh-spun warp. This produced a dense, stiff warp in which to maintain a consistent tension when weaving the shapes and joins. The pentagonal, five-sided shaped cedar and wool garments maintained the plaited side braids of the earlier cedar robes, as well as the surrounding fringe of the geometric robes. The advanced techniques of two-directional nahin weaving also produced odd auxiliary items of clothing, such as chest front bibs, waist aprons, and skin leggings. Producing the shapes of the ancient formline art was an accomplishment that gave the weavers of the coast the ability to illustrate the ancestors' stories of origin and alliances with beings encountered within the Haida environments, just as the carvers and painters had done for ages, and within the polygons of house fronts, bentwood chests, and house screens. Wrapped in the woven arts of women, the Haida journeyed through their world. Designs placed on garments created a layer that protected beyond the rain, sun, and wind. Garments were created to strengthen the wearer with supernatural alliances and declared identity within the hierarchical societies of the Northwest Coast. From one realm to another, from a person of one form to another, from storm to stillness, transformations were important concepts within the worldview of the ancestors. Clan stories featured hero transformations that were facilitated by the donning of plant and animal fiber garments. Entry into the realms of ocean, sky, and forest with geometric and formline design woven into these garments acted as connecting webs between the natural and supernatural realms. Mountain goats are not found on Haida Gwaii, but the hide and wool of this spiritually endowed being was gained by barter with mainland neighbors. In early spring, just about the time when the winter supply of dried fish reserves emptied, people converged at the mouth of the mainland's Nass River. From the early spring run of Oligans, the Tsimshian pressed and fermented the much sought-after Oligan grease. Tribes from island and coastal communities would travel to trade for the liquid gold of the Tsimshian. Haida traveled across the channel east in their huge canoes for the Oligan oil, as well as mainland plants and hides, including mountain goat wool. Sea otter, halibut, cod, tobacco, potatoes, seaweed, and spruce root woven objects were amongst the articles they bartered with, as well as their finely carved canoes. The islands of Haida Gwaii were abundant providers, and Haida held a good bargaining position in any trade they entered. Barter and trade with the many cultural groups along the Pacific Northwest coastline made the Haida prepared for the future onslaught of Euro-American maritime trade. When the new and exotic visitors came with amazing styled watercraft of oversized proportions, armed with cannons, pistols, and muskets, Haida dressed in their regalia of power, bravely greeted the strangers and ceremoniously presented gifts. Animal pelts, wool, and fur garments, as well as food items, were offered, but it was the cloaks made from the pelts of the sea otter that consequently entered the Haida into partnership with the marine fur traders from across the world. Many changes to the material culture of the Haida came with the visiting traders. Haida chiefs were presented iron, cloth, and exotic items in exchange for the cloaks and pelts of the sea otter. The leaders of the Northwest Coast nations integrated the luxury goods they garnered from the outside world into their hierarchical society, and a different era of wealth began. Within this new industry, the Haida continued to use garments for transformation and power symbols. They recognized the importance of dressing in the clothing of the Euro-American fashion, declaring to others the favors and wealth gained from the powerful traders to their territories. Greatcoats, military caps, and uniforms and European blankets worn by indigenous traders declared successes in the lucrative trade, therefore transforming and proclaiming themselves equals to the strangers off their shores. On land, the ceremonial life within the clan and village society organizations were changed very little by the new markets within their marine territories. Euro-American traders rarely set foot on land except to gather water and wood. Their influence was seen mostly in the increased luxury items used within the traditional prestige-building activities of the Haida. The sea otter robe, demanded by the Euro-American traders, became a barter commodity that eventually draped Chinese and Russian royalty. The Haida chiefs' other prestigious garments, the robes of mountain goat wool, prevailed within their ceremonial roles on the ritual stage within the clan house feasts. Connections between the ancestors and the powerful supernatural beings of the Haida world that the garments continued to embody held strong even beyond the initial era of contact and trade. It was later, in the 19th century, when the land-based trading posts, missionaries, gold seekers, and settlers arrived, that the outside world infringed upon the ancient spiritual traditions of the Haida and the Northwest Coast nations. The wool and cedar garments, products of the Haida looms, created for the protection from the inclemency of the wind, rain, and spirits of Haida Gwaii, became immersed into a historical obscurity. So that was my chapter 1. My chapter 2 goes into the Spanish who come to visit. So I'll just read one paragraph. Chapter 2. When Haida greeted Spanish Captain Juan Perez and his 200-ton frigate Santiago on July 20th, 1774, it was the first documented contact with Europeans for any of the coastal First Nations of what is now known as Southeast Alaska, British Columbia, Oregon, and Washington. So I might read the complete chapter 2 sometime in the future, but I sure hope that you enjoyed my chapter 1. Thank you so much for joining me as I weave. Hawa.